Real Madrid just hired the one manager Florentino Perez swore he'd never bring back. And the reason has almost nothing to do with football. This was a decision made by a man who never forgot 2013. A man who spent 13 years watching every single replacement fall short of the one coach he actually respected. So the question isn't why Mourinho. The question is why now? Why like this? And why against the private objections of half his own boardroom? Because when you strip away the press release, this hire wasn't tactical. It was personal. And it exposes something about the state of Real Madrid that the club has been trying to hide for months. Let's start where the decision was really made. Not the stadium. Not the training ground. A private office in Madrid, December 2025. Perez was 79 years old at that point. 7 months into the Xabi Alonso experiment. And he had already privately made up his mind that it wasn't working. According to sources close to him, that's the month he started dropping Mourinho's name into conversations with his trusted circle. Not as a serious candidate, just as a comparison point. Just as the ghost every replacement kept failing to become. Because here's what nobody outside the Bernabeu ever really understood. Perez didn't push Mourinho out in 2013 because he wanted to. He did it because he had to. The dressing room had fractured. Sergio Ramos, Iker Casillas, the Spanish core had turned on the coach. The local press had turned on him harder. And Perez, cornered, chose the players over the man. But he never chose the choice. He never believed in it. Ask anyone who was in the building back then, and they'll tell you the same thing. Perez always thought he'd let go of the wrong guy. Now fast forward to late 2025. The club is drifting. Ancelotti's second era is over. Xabi Alonso, hired with fanfare 8 months earlier, is already losing the room. There's no major trophy since 2024. Reports of tension inside the squad are leaking to the press every week. And Perez, watching all of it, keeps coming back to the same face in his head. The one that got away. That's the frame you need for everything that follows. Not a president making a cold strategic hire. A president correcting a 13-year-old decision he never made peace with. And once you see the story that way, every strange move that came next starts to make sense. The Arbeloa detour. The Benfica raid. The €15 million clause paid in cash. Even the election campaign that was built around this single name. None of it was random. All of it was a man closing a loop. But before we get to how he pulled it off, you need to understand just how bad things had actually gotten inside the club. Because the version the press was allowed to see was already ugly. What was happening behind closed doors was worse. A lot worse. Xabi Alonso arrived at the Bernabeu in the summer of 2025 carrying a reputation nobody, in Spanish football, wanted to attack. Boyhood connection to the club. Champions League winner as a player. Coming off a title-winning stretch in Germany. On paper, the perfect fit. In practice, it fell apart faster than anyone at the club expected. By the 7th month, sources inside the training ground were describing daily arguments over playing time. 2 of the most important senior players were reportedly no longer speaking to the coaching staff outside of tactical meetings. The pressing structure Alonso had brought from Leverkusen was being ignored on the pitch. And behind all, one name kept surfacing in team meetings. Vinicius Junior. The Brazilian had become, in the words of one club insider, the 10th club president. Not in a hierarchical sense. In an operational one. His camp was leaking. His agents were talking. His agenda was leaking into training ground gossip. And Alonso, a first-year manager at a club this size, had no political capital to push back. So Perez did what Perez always does when the manager is losing the room. He started planning the exit before the manager knew there was an exit. That's where the Arbeloa detour comes in. When Perez finally pulled the trigger on Alonso in the winter, Mourinho was already tied to Benfica on a fresh 2-year contract signed in September. Any move at that point would have cost the club serious money and looked, publicly, like desperation. So instead, Perez promoted the reserve team coach Alvaro Arbeloa to first-team boss. On paper, a bold internal choice. In reality, a placeholder. A bridge. A way to buy 6 months without admitting that the plan for the next manager had been drafted long before the current one was even fired. Arbeloa did his job. He beat Benfica in the Champions League. He knocked Manchester City out of the last 16. He put together a 5-match winning run that gave the fanbase a reason to breathe. And then it collapsed. Because a rookie manager with no political weight cannot survive at Real Madrid the moment the dressing room decides it doesn't want to be coached. And by March, the dressing room had decided. A physical confrontation between Aurelien Tchouameni and Federico Valverde during a squad meeting became the flashpoint. It was reported as a heated exchange. What actually happened, according to people who were in the room, was closer to a full altercation. Teammates had to pull them apart. Nobody was punished publicly. Nobody was punished privately either. And that, for Perez, was the final confirmation. Because here's the thing about Perez that gets missed in the public analysis. He's not a football man who happens to run a club. He's a president who reads dressing rooms like a boardroom. And what he was reading by March 2026 was a group of players who had figured out that they were more powerful than any coach the club was willing to hire. That's the moment the theoretical Mourinho conversation stopped being theoretical. Because there was suddenly only one name on the shortlist that could actually walk into that room and not be devoured by it. But before Perez could make the move, he had to survive something else first. And most fans watching from outside had no idea it was even happening. While the Mourinho plan was quietly firming up, another list was being drawn up in parallel. And the names on it tell you everything about what Perez was really looking for. Mauricio Pochettino was mentioned. No formal contact, no negotiation, just conversations. Didier Deschamps came up. Unai Emery was floated by advisors and killed on the spot by Perez himself, who has never warmed to him. There were even rumors around Jurgen Klopp, though the German had already publicly stated he wasn't leaving his Red Bull role. And then there was the strangest name on the list. Lionel Scaloni, the Argentina manager, who was tentatively approached through Madrid's football director Santiago Solari. Every single one of those names had one thing in common. None of them had ever coached at Real Madrid before. And that, according to a source close to Perez quoted in reporting at the time, was the disqualifier. Because the president's line to his inner circle was simple. Quote, "The coach has to be chosen by the president." End quote. What that really meant, decoded, was this. The coach has to be someone I already know how to manage. Look at Perez's pattern since his second presidential term began in 2009. Ancelotti was rehired for a second spell. Zidane was rehired for a second spell. And now Mourinho, being rehired for a second spell. That's not a coincidence. That's a philosophy. Perez does not want to spend 6 months learning a new manager's psychology while the dressing room burns. He wants a known quantity. He wants someone who already understands how the political machine at the Bernabeu operates. And more than anything, he wants someone who owes him something. Mourinho, at that moment, owed him nothing on paper. But emotionally, the debt ran deep in both directions. Perez believed he had wronged Mourinho by not fighting harder for him in 2013. Mourinho, since then, had been drifting. Chelsea, second spell. Tottenham, Roma, Fenerbahce, Benfica. Every job smaller than the last. Every project further from the elite. His stock in world football had been in slow decline for the better part of a decade. Not because he'd stopped being a great coach, but because the sport had moved on from confrontational, media-driven, siege mentality managers. Guardiola won. Klopp won. The new school of possession, pressing, and player-friendly leadership had rewritten what an elite manager was supposed to look like. And Mourinho, still the same Mourinho, was suddenly a relic. Except for one man. The one man who never bought into the new orthodoxy. The one man who still believed that the manager who could win you a title in a war zone was worth more than the manager who could win you a title in a laboratory. And that man happened to be the president of the biggest club in the world. So when Perez started making his calls in early 2026, he wasn't calling around because he was undecided. He was calling around because he wanted the record to show that he had considered alternatives. He hadn't. There was only ever one name. Everyone else was theater. The problem, of course, was that Mourinho was under contract. And Benfica were not in the business of doing Real Madrid favors. Mourinho had signed with Benfica in September 2025. A 2-year deal. On paper, tight. In the contract, though, there were 2 exit doors. The first was a break clause of roughly €6 million, but it was only valid until the 29th of May. The second was a straight release fee of €15 million, valid at any time. Missed the May deadline, and the cost of extraction more than doubled. That's important, because what happened next was Perez making a decision that cost his club €9 million extra. And he made it on purpose. Here's the timeline that never got fully explained in the mainstream coverage. Madrid had been planning to announce Mourinho on the week of Monday, May 25th. That timing was deliberate. It would have activated the cheaper clause. All the paperwork was being finalized. Then, on May 12th, Perez himself called a presidential election. And 2 days before the planned announcement, a challenger emerged. Enrique Riquelme, A renewable energy entrepreneur with money, ambition, and a campaign strategy built around promising Erling Haaland, if he won. Suddenly, the Mourinho announcement wasn't just a football hire. It was ammunition. If Perez announced Mourinho as scheduled, he'd have paid €6 million and locked in his prize before the election was even contested. Clean, cheap, efficient. But it would have looked like a technocratic move. A boardroom transaction, not a campaign promise. So Perez did something that only makes sense when you understand how deep this decision was inside him personally. He waited. He let the deadline pass. He paid the extra €9 million. And he turned the Mourinho hire into the centerpiece of his re-election campaign. His team essentially revealed the appointment during the campaign itself. Benfica, boxed in, then publicly confirmed that Madrid had informed them of their firm intention to trigger the €15 million clause if Perez won, which meant every Madrid member voting in that election knew exactly what a vote for Perez was buying. Not just a president, a manager, a specific manager, the one everyone in that fan base had spent 13 years wondering about. Perez won the election. On the 9th of June, Mourinho flew to Madrid. On the 11th, the announcement went out. €9 million extra spent to turn a hire into a coronation. Ask any political consultant, and they'll tell you that's cheap. Ask any accountant, and they'll tell you it's insane. And that's exactly the split that describes Perez's presidency in one sentence. He operates like a politician wearing an accountant's suit. And in this case, the politician won. There's a smaller detail buried in the reporting that tells you even more. When Perez needed a signature move to answer the Haaland promise from his challenger, he could have picked any headline hire. A Galactico signing, a new sporting director, a stadium project. He picked a manager, because he knew, better than any advisor around him, that this fan base would forgive almost any transfer failure if the manager on the sideline was the right one. And in Perez's reading of the room, the right one had a name he'd been carrying around for over a decade. Now, let's be fair to the counter-argument. Because there is one, and it's serious. The case against bringing Mourinho back in 2026 is not just about football philosophy. It's about a specific event that happened 5 months before his appointment. A Champions League playoff first leg in Lisbon. Benfica against Real Madrid. The match was suspended after Vinicius Junior alleged that Benfica winger Gianluca Prestiani had racially abused him during play. Prestiani denied the racial allegation and was later banned by UEFA and FIFA after admitting to a homophobic slur, not a racist one. The distinction matters legally. It did not matter emotionally, because on the night Mourinho, coaching Benfica, publicly suggested that Vinicius had incited the incident himself. Sources close to the player told The Athletic at the time that the comment did not go down well with the Brazilian. The immediate read from most observers was straightforward. Mourinho had just publicly damaged his relationship with the most important attacking player at Real Madrid. Any future scenario involving him coaching Vinicius looked, at that moment, close to impossible. 5 months later, Real Madrid hired him anyway. And here's where the story gets interesting. Because the same sources who reported the initial fallout have now stated that Vinicius has no problem with the appointment. That's a huge public shift. And there are 2 ways to read it. The generous read is that Mourinho and Vinicius have already spoken privately, that fences have been mended, that the player has accepted the coach's authority. The cynical read is that Vinicius has been made to accept the appointment because his own political capital inside the club has quietly eroded during the same crisis that brought Mourinho back. Either way, this is the biggest live risk of the entire hire. And Perez knows it, because the last time Mourinho coached this club, he ended his tenure at war with the Spanish core. Ramos, Casillas, the leaders of the dressing room. If he ends this tenure at war with the Brazilian core, it will not just be a repeat. It will be a career sentence for both men. And yet, Perez still made the move, which tells you something crucial about how he's reading the current squad. He does not believe the Brazilian core will win a war against a manager with his backing. Not this time. Not with the dressing room already fractured. Not with the players having spent the last 6 months proving they cannot self-govern under either Alonso or Arbeloa. The president is essentially betting that the disciplinary vacuum inside the club is now so severe that even a divisive coach is preferable to no coach at all. That's a genuinely hard bet to make. And it might be wrong. There is a real non-trivial universe in which Mourinho walks into the same room he left in 2013 and gets swallowed by it a second time. Perez has accepted that risk. Openly, internally, reportedly with the language of a man who has decided he'd rather be wrong with Mourinho than right with anyone else. That's not football logic. That's legacy logic. And it explains why the internal opposition which existed was ultimately overruled without much resistance. There were voices inside the club who raised concerns. Quiet voices, the kind that get logged but not amplified. Some board members reportedly asked whether Mourinho's confrontational style was really the right medicine for a dressing room already this fractured. Others pointed out that the manager's stock in world football had been in decline for years, and that hiring him now was at best a nostalgic bet. All of it was heard. None of it changed the outcome, because Perez had already made the decision the moment Xabi Alonso started losing the room in early 2026. Everything after that was administration. And this is where the appointment stops being about Mourinho at all, and becomes about something bigger. What you're actually watching is a 79-year-old president running out of runway, choosing his own comfort zone over strategic diversity. He knows Mourinho. He knows how to negotiate with Mourinho. He knows what Mourinho will demand and what Mourinho will accept. He does not know Pochettino that way. He does not know Deschamps that way. And in the twilight of his presidency, comfort has become policy. That's the hidden thesis behind the entire hire. Not that Mourinho is the best available manager in world football right now. Almost nobody serious would argue that. But that he is the manager Florentino Perez is most equipped to work within the year and a half he has left before the next election cycle. Continuity of president, not continuity of project. Which brings us to the harder question. The one Perez himself may not want to answer publicly. If Mourinho succeeds, does that vindicate a hire built almost entirely on personal history? Or does it just prove that Real Madrid is a club where the president's psychology matters more than the coach's tactics? And if Mourinho fails, does that end Perez's era? Or does it just clear the way for the next familiar name on his list, which reportedly, according to whispers already circulating in Madrid, may include a return of Zidane before the decade is out? There is no clean answer here. There is no clean answer because there wasn't a clean process. This was not a search. This was a homecoming. And homecomings in football as in life are almost never really about the person coming home. They're about the person doing the inviting. What Perez has done in the summer of 2026 is invite the ghost of his own most complicated decision back into the building. To finish something he never got to finish. To prove something he never got to prove. To close a loop only he ever really felt open. Whether it works is a question for the next 12 months. Whether it was the right thing to do is a question for the historians. But what it reveals about who really runs Real Madrid and how they make their biggest decisions is a question you can already answer. And the answer is not the badge. The answer is not the players. The answer is a man in a private office in Madrid, 79 years old, still thinking about 2013. So what do you think? Is this a masterstroke or a mistake? Is Perez fixing a 13-year-old wound or reopening one? Drop your take in the comments. The next chapter of the story is going to write itself fast, and I want to know where you're standing before it does. If you made it this far, hit subscribe because we're going to be tracking every twist of this Mourinho era as it unfolds. Thanks for watching.